Welcome to If Prices Could Talk, the podcast where we dive into the art and science of pricing, sales, and negotiation. I'm your host, Tracy Dent. Join me as we explore strategies and current events shaping the future of pricing power in B2B, featuring insights from industry leaders and subject matter experts. Let's jump into today's conversation. Scott and Patrick, thank you both for being here. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Always a pleasure.
You two have known each other for years, and then Scott goes back even further, predating Patrick being a partner at the firm, right?
Much
Scott,
further.
I was going to say, can you take us back?
Yeah, really old. Yeah, Reed Holden came in to Medtronic. I brought him in to help us out with some strategy on a new product launch. So yeah, very familiar with Holden Advisors, very familiar with Patrick, and recommend Holden to anyone that I run across.
Do you remember what year you did actually bring Reed in?
Ballpark, it was probably right around 2013 in that time frame.
Got it.
All right.
And then he had some executive roundtables over the years that I was fortunate to be part of. Those were cross industry, where he would bring problems to the group, and even brought a potential pricing curriculum to the group for us to work on. Those are great sessions. That might have been when we first met at one of those, Patrick.
I think so. Yeah.
That's great. Can you tell us a bit about your role currently in the company that you're working for, Scott?
Yeah, I've switched gears. I'm currently at RhythmScience, we're a startup in the cardiac data management space. So there are oceans of cardiac data transmissions from connected devices, pacemakers, defibrillators, wearable devices, connected blood pressure cuffs and scales. And all of these transmissions are coming in from different manufacturer portals, different logins. The reporting styles are all different. So we're completely device agnostic, and we customize and standardize the reporting, integrate with the EMR. It helps clinics better automate their workflow, their billing, their scheduling, that kind of thing. So we have the most comprehensive platform, single sign-on across implantables, wearables, and heart failure and hypertension devices. So prior to that, I have almost 20 years of experience from, Fortune 50 company like Medtronic down to the Series A company, RhythmScience, across implantables, wearables, disposables, capital equipment, and now software and service. So unlike physician preference items at RhythmScience, we're bringing efficiencies and opportunities to generate lost revenue. And unlike capital equipment, it's very low cost. $4 per patient per month, for example. So that's what I'm doing now. I love it.
Really cool.
Not as pricing focused. I'm broader. Right now I'm heading up finance and really marketing. But I really enjoy it. We have a great product.
What is it like to own finance and marketing? Two functions that typically don't roll up under the same executive leader.
Yeah, we're tiny. We only have 40 direct FTEs. So, well, it's I love it. I'd love to be more involved in sales initially. Briefly, I was also running sales as interim commercial officer. What's great is you're still close to the commercial side. Marketing is part of the commercial team, really, and you're close to that strategic direction. But on the finance side, it helps me forecast how we're doing. I'm in the know. It brings different challenges, which I enjoy. I prefer to have my hands in multiple areas, so I like it a lot.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to talk to both of you about is how to leverage data and analytics, especially with sales. Because given your spot internally, Scott, I would imagine there's a lot of places where data can come in handy just in having sellers be more confident. Obviously, Patrick, you've got a ton of experience in this also. Like, how do you kind of work with teams to balance intuition and data? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. Broadly speaking, supply chain is kicking everyone's ass. They're very impressive. So if you go back to like pre-2005 in medtech, you had independent physicians controlling the decision making. This was pre-Sunshine Act. Reps were taking them golfing into clubs. And post-2005, you started to see hospitals acquiring physician practices. Why? It empowered them, gave them leverage. And supply chain and procurement, they're negotiating across all service lines, and they do a great job. I'm very impressed by those groups. I mean, Warren Buffett famously said that the single most important decision when he evaluates a business is pricing power. Mm-hmm. So the first thing we did to combat that was not analytics based. It was creating a portfolio of products. Reed talks about it in his books. So by 2009, we wouldn't launch a single pacemaker anymore. We'd launch a family of pacemakers, or portfolio. So that was the first thing. But I've talked to both of you about this before. My goal in negotiations was always to use facts, not FRIG. So FRIG is fear, rhetoric, intuition, and gut. And I have an interesting story. I actually, in one negotiation, observed all four of these things. So I was invited to, there's a Southern Strategic Sourcing Partners or something like that, some coalition in the Southeast, Florida, Georgia, Alabama. And I came down to help. There were 4 territory managers involved because there were maybe a dozen hospitals. There's this huge U-shaped room with about 30 administrators, electrophysiologists, doctors. And I asked the sales team, hey, do you guys want to present the benefits of the products? And then I'll tell them how we arrived at the pricing, because they had an RFP. Oh no, Scott, you just do everything. So they're behind this horseshoe of 30 people, basically eating popcorn, watching me. And I was fielding questions for an hour. It was one of these where each vendor came in sequentially. So we left and Boston Scientific came in. And where I really saw the FRIG come out was, we went to the hotel bar after, and over the course of 2 hours, one person was like, my gut tells me we should drop our price. So there was gut. Another one was in communications with a former colleague of his, saying how, I think they're going to drop their price, so rhetoric, or they're meeting all the price points, right? There are price points laid out. Another one was like, I'm afraid we're going to lose this, so fear. All of these came out in a couple hours. and that's really when I started to think about, okay, FRIG is how we're making decisions. We're not using facts. By the way, we didn't change our price. Before my flight the next day at noon, they agreed to the contract. So these things need to be eliminated because it results in lower pricing. So what we did, the most effective things in negotiations were benchmark tools with our own pricing and all the demographic categories you can build into it. So it might be their GPO or IDN affiliation, their size, that kind of thing. And that allowed us to build cohorts and say, okay, for a cohort similar to this customer, our prices should be here, not what you've requested. Other things similar to that were deciles. Okay, this is a 70th decile customer. You're trying to give them 20th decile pricing. If it was a very big customer, we started to get into price ranks. Okay, you're asking for the 3rd lowest price in the country. That would be impactful to people. So those are some of the tools that we used. I mean, the supply chains had third-party data from IQVIA and ECRI and Definitive Health. Those came out like 10 to 15 years ago, but they never had net pricing. They didn't have net of rebates. So that's kind of the main way that we help empower sellers, and they could bring that to the customer as rationale, because they could never answer how they arrived at a price. And that's why they were losing to supply chain.
Scott, you had me. So I actually started in the med device industry in 2003. So I got about maybe 2-3 years before the Sunshine Act really took over. So for me, it was very impactful because I got to see the before and after. And
can you say what that is for people that don't know what the Sunshine Act is?
Yes. So the Sunshine Act was a rule passed by Congress. I believe it was Congress, passed by government, basically limiting the entertainment funds that could be applied to physicians across the country. It was a US-based thing, of course, US government instituted. And what basically came to light is that Medicare is the single biggest healthcare payer across the US. They felt as if there was a conflict of interest if medical device companies could spend whatever they wanted on entertainment, loosely defined, for physicians, and that it created this conflict of interest and needed to be regulated or limited. So what the Sunshine Act set out to do is put in place very specific rules and regulations on how suppliers, medical device companies, any medical institution, pharma included, anyone in the medical space, it put in place regulations and limits on entertainment spending in support of any type of medical provider, basically. Scott, anything else to add on that?
The only thing I'd add, you nailed it. Also, any advisory relationships, because you could have a key opinion leader that maybe was part of a clinical study. And if they were to come to present at a function or at a conference, you could pay them a per diem or a stipend or even an hourly rate, but that had to be disclosed as part of the Sunshine Act.
Right. And the basis behind this is twofold, and it's going to lead into, I think, a very important contributor to this idea of fear, rhetoric, intuition, and gut. And that is that there traditionally were very high switching costs involved in physician preference items. Scott, you used that word before, but basically this idea that once you converted a customer, so either you grew that customer with new novel technologies, or you converted that customer, that physician, over from a competitive product area to your own. In doing so, you created a greater customer lifetime value because switching costs were very high. So companies went to great lengths to capture market share, basically, because they knew that once they captured that market share, it was sticky. And the customer lifetime value associated with that conversion or new account growth was very, very high. So they were willing to spend lots and lots of resources on acquiring new customers because the payoff was so great over time.
Yeah.
Where I'm going with this is the Sunshine Act began to limit the ways in which the resources that could be applied to acquire new customers. It put regulations in place, right? And it made companies think differently about how they were engaging with new customers. However, instead of limiting fear, rhetoric, intuition, and gut, it actually increased those three things because they didn't have the same arsenal at their disposal to potentially bring a new account over to the company. And so what happened is it somewhat leveled the playing field, but it increased competition for these accounts. And so each incremental account was viewed as being so valuable by sales teams. I'm going to use the word, and Scott, I'm going to pose this as a question to you. I felt like the balance and power shifted to the sales team in that sales really had greater control over what happened within companies because it was so important to grow market share and to acquire new accounts that, in my perspective or from my experience, actually sometimes bad decisions were being made because sales had a greater influence over total commercial decisions than they otherwise would in another given market scenario. So, Scott, as we think about the power that sales had and this idea of FRIG and its impact on negotiations, what role does sales influence play over ultimately the evolution of medical negotiations, especially with sophisticated procurement teams?
They play a massive role, and you're correct. The balance of power did shift, and what would happen, Patrick, if you closed an account, if you closed the customer, it was 100% flawless sales execution and leveraging relationships, and any loss was, well, the pricing team didn't give me the price, and that's what it was, right? That was the playback. So the sales team was influencing product launch strategy. They were, and that has an effect across the whole organization, right? That starts to change how you market a product, how you go to market. It can affect the amount of dollars you can even spend on R&D. So it definitely had far-reaching impacts, and that did happen. Going back to analytics, some of the other things we would do, because we'd review 50 contracts a week, and most of the time we were changing the proposal in some way, either adding more commitment or raising a price. But the sellers had to be on board. If they didn't have confidence, they weren't going to close it. So other things we would do, account scoring can be helpful. So we had kind of a 2x2 of size and also commitment. So if it's a larger account that's willing to commit, then there's a better account score and you can give them some more price concessions. Is there more valuable long term? Yeah. Other things I would do is we'd show sellers how many share points they need to move if they went to this price. So now it's impacting their own pocketbook. Oh, I need 110% market share. Well, that can't happen. Okay, well, maybe you shouldn't concede so much on ASP and trust your product and your sales process and your relationship. So those things can help. One last thing on that topic, Patrick, do you guys don't offer primary research for postmortems on win-loss drivers? Do you?
Yes, we do, because oftentimes we're brought in to validate pricing after the fact. So it's part of our continual kind of pricing analysis that we will do to companies. But it's done oftentimes, it's disassociated from specific deals and it's looked at more holistically. So not necessarily just on a very high stakes negotiation, but companies will bring us in to provide that post-mortem win-loss analysis, but more in terms of broad-based customer feedback for continual price management.
Oh, perfect. And that is incredibly powerful to go back to your last 40 deals. And this is particularly useful in longer sales cycle products, but I think it could be useful for any, and have a third party like Holden go in and talk to the customer. What really contributed to this decision? And ideally you'd have a mix of about 75% losses and 25% wins. So you understand, okay, it may or may not have been great salesmanship that won you a deal or lost you a deal. And it may or may not have been price that lost you a deal. And it's incredibly powerful to understand, why are we winning? Why are we losing?
Scott, it's so interesting because one of the things that in retrospect I think a lot of us saw in industry is that with the increase of data and analytics and a decrease in intuition or rhetoric-based decision-making, it really changed the seller dynamic. So those sellers who were truly embracing value-based selling principles and were really effective at their job, the data proved that out, right? They rose to the top very quickly. And those that were selling using other methods, which can remain nameless, but really truly just relationship-based or really building out their book of business in other ways, those sellers often struggled, right? They couldn't maintain their same effectiveness with the same level of transparency and data sharing that the industry evolved into. Did you see that as well?
Absolutely. But I also saw, I did see that the best sellers were using value-based. They weren't using frig. They retained their customers. They didn't drop their price as much. They didn't come in for floor approvals because they didn't need to. But I also saw some weaker sellers that did sell on price. The person that cost the industry the most value from Medtronic while I was there was in Atlanta, bought all the business across. There's some major hospital systems in that area. Bought all the business. This is in CRM, so pacemakers and defibrillators, and got one President's Club right for that year. Ended up getting promoted to regional vice president of sales in the Northeast, so in a different market. Didn't have to deal with the aftermath. So I see why it happens, and sadly, some of those folks are rewarded. But to have a long-term healthy business, value-based selling is obviously the way to go.
Mm-hmm. It's hard sometimes, obviously, like in the moment, to see the potential impact in the bigger picture. So can you both walk us through, like, drug-eluting stents was something that came up as an innovation, has kind of gone through the whole cycle back down into commoditization in a way. But when people are in this race to the bottom, like how does that play out? I think that's a good place to go.
So it's a perfect example, Tracy. Those came out in the very early 2000s. Cordis at the time was part of J&J, and their pricing was in the $3,000 to $4,000 a stent. There's a Harvard Business Review article on, I think it was considered price gouging, sort of. They were getting the maximum price for this, and drug-eluting stents were a massive benefit to the patient, right? They replaced the bare metal stent, significantly reduced restenosis. I mean, significantly, like by 70 or 80%. And they were the only player for a while. By the time Medtronic came to play with competitive product on a competitive delivery platform was in 2012. And by then, prices had gone from 3,000 to like 1,800. The last stent that I was part of the launch team was in 2017, and prices were 900 to 1,000 in the US, and as low as $100 in places like Germany, and even Canada was getting there. So it's a great example of how a strong technology, a huge advancement, how quickly over 15 years the price eroded. And I'd say the problem with that particular product was from a price preservation standpoint, you couldn't really build a base model and a premium, or a standard and a premium. Standard of care was a certain delivery system. The different drugs, the elution rates are similar, the restenosis is similar. So there weren't really enough features to have a fighter product, which made competitive pricing very prevalent. Every week, there was a new lowest price in the country. There was a ton of frig at that time. And every negotiation was a prisoner's dilemma. There were only three players. It was Abbott, Medtronic, Boston Scientific, really. We tried to do things like bundling across different cardiac categories, trying to pull it through that way, trying to use rebates to get commitment and hide pricing, because as soon as you put a price on invoice, it went to every third-party site. So that was one of the most difficult pricing problems I've ever been faced with.
And there are countless other examples, right? Drug-eluting stents is not the only product category that went through a very similar life cycle. When you look at plastic surgery, if you look at orthopedics, if you look at even general surgery with some of their capital equipment and imaging, products follow a more escalated price drop in the medical device industry over time. And I think largely that's due to sophisticated pricing organizations, right? It is in their best interest to quote unquote commoditize product lines and increase competition so as to drive prices lower, right? That is a very high level summary, but that is their goal. And they're very effective at what they do, right?
Supply chain is very strong.
Yes.
And you're right. They apply it. It isn't just drug-eluting stents. Spine, for sure. You have rods and screws. That's what they refer to it as. Well, they're all the same, even though they're not. I mean, we have in a consumer marketplace, we have differentiated pricing on bottles of water, all right? But yet we couldn't maintain pricing on some of these incredible advancements for patients. And I loved you had Steve Pearson out from Zimmer. I loved how he said, if I drop the price of a knee replacement, I'm not going to generate more knee replacements. So there's incidence and prevalence of a disease, and dropping the price isn't increasing volume in this area. But you're also right; it happens even with pacemakers. Luckily, the next step in pacemakers was leadless, and that pumped the price back up. But without significant innovation, there aren't opportunities to reset the market very often.
Yeah. I think the other piece that plays a very important role is this idea of profit margins, right? Profit margins in the med tech, med device space are very high. Now, they're very high for well-stated reasons, or maybe not well-stated reasons, depending on your point of view on the subject. But a lot of money gets reinvested back into research and development, innovation, and other categories that are defensible to some degree, right? Public companies state their reinvestment of their high margins because the margin profile in medtech and medical devices is fairly high across comparable industries.
Yeah.
But I think for me, and Scott, I want to ask you about this, is I feel that that high margin profile leads to a greater erosion of price in market because they simply have more margin to play with. In other industries, when the difference between your cost basis, however you want to calculate it, and your price and market is much tighter, you're not as willing to discount and to discount to as large a degree as you would if you had a very high margin profile.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I cut my teeth in the airline industry, right? To print in color, I needed a code, right? I get to Medtronic and people are printing emails in color. I'm like, what is going on here? And yes, that applied to. I built an EBIT model to try and help justify decision making at it was okay. Ascension, right? They're renowned for being fantastic supply chain negotiators, and it to try to use EBIT to justify a pricing decision because these margins are what they are, it's very difficult. And that particular example, it worked. We said no. We lost 30 points a share, and our EBIT dollars ended up being higher than had we agreed to the price. So you're absolutely right. But on that topic, if you will, for a second, because you have a lot of listeners that are not in med tech, when these prices drop, for example, drug-eluting stents, do the patients benefit? The patients benefit because they pay lower prices?
Well, that's a very loaded question, Scott. I mean, oftentimes, no, there's not a direct correlation between what patients are paying and the price of the goods and services.
No, reimbursement increased during this whole period where drug-eluting stent prices declined. So what does that mean? Who's benefiting? Okay, maybe hospitals which have low margins are able to use some of that money for capital equipment. That's great. But for a patient, because the pricing went down on the device, it didn't help their wallet at all. And in fact, innovation was stifled. You know, there were attempts to do a bioabsorbable stent. The initial products weren't what they needed to be. And rather than continuing to invest in that R&D, pretty much shelved it. I'm not sure where it is today, but not as much was invested because of that. So the patients aren't realizing the price gains, is what I'm saying.
Absolutely. And that brings us into it's a great segue into our next topic. When we think about this, the reason why innovation is stifled, I think, to bridge it back to the theory, is your projected price point in market for any new innovation goes down with your price erosion that happens in previous categories. It's very hard to continually bring price back up to where it might have been before, even with innovation. And so we know, as we think about the financial projections around investing in new innovations and technologies, the proposed price point of that new innovation or technology is critical, right? That drives your financial model around what the net worth of this new innovation could be for a firm. And ultimately, that drives a lot of decision-making around where to invest resources and why. So when we think about this idea of setting a new price point in market, whether it be a complete market disruptor or an incremental improvement or innovation, Scott, how have you thought about setting new prices in market, and what has been your process? Think about any of the past clinical specialty areas you've worked on. How have you thought about pricing for new products and services?
So companies often get this wrong for two reasons. They believe that with a new product or any product, that pricing and share must have an inverse relationship. They do not. If you have a new innovative technology, you can get price and grow share. Many company leaders that are not in the pricing discipline they don't consider pricing a science. They think anyone can do it. So what we did, and what I would recommend people to do, is determine, you can use past launches, you can use your current products, determine what truly drives price in your space. So we came up with PAM, a product assessment model. PAM was very near and dear to us. We had determined there were 8 drivers of pricing in our medtech cardiac space. Physician preference, clinical evidence, reimbursement did factor in. If it went up, it usually didn't go up, but if it did, there was value there. The hospital economics of a new product, the patient factors, competition, and field execution, and Medtronic environment. So your environment might be your cadence. If you haven't come out with a new product in 5 years, you're more likely to get a bigger lift than if you come out and iterate with a new product every year. So we had those 8 drivers. We weighted them. They weren't all the same weight. So you assign a weight and you just keep testing it over time. It's not perfect, but after a few launches, you have a more and more refined model as you get the weightings right. So that's how we really did it. And to feel good about the inputs of the model, I would suggest market research. We typically were able to get our answers through a Van Westy or even a qualitative, because the conjoints were just too expensive, in my opinion, and yielded a similar answer. But if you think about, and we'd also survey our own internal teams. So I would ask our sellers, if we made 1 unit of this new pacemaker, just 1 unit, what's the most you could sell it for? Okay, and then at the other end of the, if you think of an XY graph of price and mix or volume, at what price will you convert all of your current business to this product? Well, there might be no uplift. It might be $100. So now you have the endpoints, and you can use market research and internal research to build a curve and come up with your pricing strategy. So that's how we did it.
Makes total sense. It's a question we get from our clients often. How did you decide between when to use survey-based and when to use more qualitative or customer interview-based market research? Did you guys were you premeditated in your approach to market research, or did you let the given circumstance drive your choice of market research?
Sadly, a lot of times it was the budget available, or maybe how important that launch was. So we would perform more robust research for a quote unquote more important launch, a larger innovation, than we would kind of an iterative product launch. So there wasn't any magic behind it, but you can really glean a lot from a 30-person qualitative. Actually, you don't necessarily need to have 500 data points. That's what I found.
Got it.
I have one interesting example on new pricing. Medtronic launched a product called Link, which was an insertable diagnostic. It was not therapeutic. That could be, it was a device when a patient was having syncope or cryptogenic stroke, some unexplained heart rhythm issues, and it would monitor their heart activity and help diagnose the issue. It was very innovative because of the size and how easy it was you could inject it, put a Band-Aid on, and they were done. The business unit had observed the price erosion across all of these other cardiac lines. They said, "Oh, we're going to come up with a price. We have one price point. We're going to do one price point. It's $4,500. The previous model was bigger. It had to be a pocket cut open. And those were like $3,300. So that's an interesting approach. Let us do a little work on it, and we'll give you a recommendation. You can use it, or you can go with your one price." And there was one meeting I'll never forget. There were 12 regional vice presidents at the time, and the business unit was pitching the product, and the VPs were sitting at 4 tables, and I said, "Okay, each table, come up with your price point for the product." They were all different, right? And my point was, every hospital has a different willingness and ability to pay. So with one price, Some places you're penetrating, some places you're skimming, but you're not maximizing. So we did a little research. We came up with a 4-tier grid based on volume. I think the highest tier was $5,400. At the end of the first year, the average selling price was $5,000, and they sold as many as they could build. It was like a $300 million improvement versus a single price point. So my point is, no matter the innovation or the approach, you should always put some rigor into devising the pricing strategy for new product launch.
In those early days, how do you deal with like the sales team is under pressure, whether external or their own anxiety to deliver volume? What are those conversations like?
Yeah, every quarter was the most important quarter in the history of the company, right? So I'm sure that's true at every company. It's a great question, Tracy. The first thing would be a launch plan. So expectations are set. And you can use that account scoring that I talked about earlier. But if possible, securing uplifts at your loyal customers first and building that sales team confidence and touting those wins is a great way to launch and show that, okay, the pricing strategy that we all aligned on, because in my opinion, the best approach is the pricing team makes a recommendation. The business unit and the sales team, the business unit has to own it. The sales team has to buy in, or the launch is going to be shaky at best. Then you get the key opinion leaders touting the benefits. And when you start to go into your competitive accounts, and this can still be pretty quickly, if you go to your most loyal customers the first 2 to 5 weeks, get them on board, you can go to your first group of competitive accounts quickly and let them know you can get your hands on this new product. You can get it ahead of others, but there is going to be a price lift. And that's one way to start getting price lifts at competitive accounts early on. And once that belief spreads and that confidence spreads, that works really well. Now, if it's a less differentiated iterative launch, then ahead of time, what we would do is put a list together. What things are valuable to you? So for a large company, it might be locking in business over a long period of time. For a small company like RhythmScience, it's important for us to get paid quickly. So going on auto pay is a benefit. So what pieces of value to your organization are there that you could trade in lieu of maybe a price uplift? And that could be a backup plan for a less differentiated product launch.
Get those levers set up.
Yeah.
That's cool. Well, let's talk about private equity a little bit, because you had mentioned, Scott, like different hospitals' ability to pay, willingness to pay. Then we've also got kind of this newer-ish dynamic of private equity purchasing physician locations or practices. So what are you seeing? I mean, maybe one of you can just talk about what's happening, and then we'll kind of unpack it.
I don't have answers for you, Tracy, but what we are noticing is, way back, private practices were being purchased by hospitals, acquired by hospitals. Physicians, wanted more reasonable hours, and that gave supply chain power at hospitals. What's been happening the last 3 years very aggressively are PE groups are interested in cardiology practices. I think this actually, back to stents, I think this really picked up when the PCI, the drug-eluting stent procedure, could be done outside of the cath lab and sort of in a office-based lab. And just in the last couple of years, like 50 practices have been purchased, 350 clinics. It's not a huge percentage of the overall cardiology clinic population, but the velocity is increasing. Examples of these PE groups are like U.S. Heart and Vascular Partners, CVA USA. So that, they're becoming more prevalent, and I think they're still purchasing mostly independent practices. Patrick, I haven't done a lot of research on it, but if hospitals were to sell off their cardiology practices, maybe they need a cash infusion, then they're actually selling some of their leverage. A lot of their leverage is how I would see it playing out.
We've seen both, actually. And this started I mean, back in the 80s and 90s, even the largest private equity firms were going out and buying up private hospitals and combining them. So they saw the value, the profit available in industry. But recently, let's call it the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen smaller, more specialized private equity funds and groups begin to go out and buy largely physician-owned opportunities, surgery centers, right? Outpatient clinics, as you mentioned, Scott, when the pacemaker procedure shifted from an inpatient to an outpatient procedure, it opened up the opportunity to move from the hospital, typical brick and mortar setting, to more of an outpatient clinic, and a lot of volume shifted. And with that, a lot of opportunity. And so whether it be in the cardiovascular space, the orthopedic space, the plastics space as well, as more procedures shifted to the surgery centers and more physicians own the surgery centers, physicians wanted an exit, and they had two options. They could either sell to the hospitals or they could sell to another financial player. Oftentimes, private equity filled that role. Now, Scott,
Yeah.
you mentioned another scenario, which is also really important, which is as smaller hospital systems or smaller hospital players, if they got into any type of a financial situation where they needed to raise funds, private equity firms were there ready and willing to pick up any of the facilities that they wanted to sell off because they saw a lot of value in running those facilities the way they would term it as more efficiently, really cutting costs and figuring out ways to increase profit within those institutions. So there was a lot of opportunity there. So I think private equity has been in and around the healthcare space for some time, and how they're acquiring assets and what they're doing with those assets has kind of evolved with the healthcare market. Now, that said, it does create a very interesting scenario, Scott, because these sophisticated procurement organizations that had incredible leverage, a lot of that leverage is built off of scale. And so as you break up that scale, to your point, Scott, what's going to happen with the negotiating power of these institutions over time?
I would have to believe that would start to falter. I mean, the supply chains, the best supply chains would first align the physician group and say, okay, we have these 3 products from 3 different manufacturers. Tell me what your patient population, what can you use to treat them? Are all 3 acceptable? Are only 2 of them acceptable? And they would have that alignment internally prior to any negotiation. So they would know, okay, I can negotiate fiercely because my physician groups have approved that I don't really need, player X's product. So I'm going to see how low I can get them. Once I get them there, I'm going to pressure the other 2 players to see if they can get there. And we're back to the prisoner's dilemma. So if they lose that ability, they've actually sold off much of their leverage.
Yeah, it is interesting when you say it that way because the same negotiation principles apply. For us at Holden Advisors, there really aren't any new procurement tactics that are being utilized. They're being utilized in different ways with more conviction at times, but the same playbook exists, right?
Yeah.
And so the question is, as more financial owners come into the market, maybe saying it a little bit differently, should it change our approach as suppliers into the market and how we negotiate with them? Right? Do we need to deal with them differently because of the ownership group, the ownership philosophy or philosophical approach?
I think the most difficult problem for pricing leaders and sellers in this environment, at least in the cardiac space, is you still have a hospital pricing structure that's likely to be higher than any ASC, ambulatory surgery center, or any OBL, which is an office-based lab, or any PE group, which are more financially motivated. No matter what, the hospital still is patient care. It will always be their number one priority, and it always should be. And I'm not saying ASCs or OBLs that it's not, but they are looking at the bottom line maybe a little bit more closely. So now you have pretty disparate price points. Ideally, you would have different products if you could. If you can differentiate the products, you can maintain a set of prices that are a bit higher in the hospital environment and that are lower for these PE groups and ASCs and OBLs. That was starting to happen in some of the cardiac spaces still when I was at Medtronic. And we would use the bottom part of the portfolio to compete in those areas, which are still great products. I don't want people listening to think like, oh, I'm going to get a shoddy device if I have this done at an outpatient clinic. That's not true at all. If you're a primary prevention, if you're getting a defibrillator for primary prevention, so you avoid cardiac arrest, but you don't have heart failure, you don't need all of these heart failure features monitoring the fluid status of your heart. You just don't need it. It's not like there are bad products there.
Yeah. So it sounds like really it's just a greater segmentation of patient characteristics and needs to align them with the right facility for the care that meets their needs.
I believe so, Patrick. You can't bring your most featured devices in at those prices and not have that seep into the hospital sector. So if you're going to make that decision, you have to expect that pricing is going to leak.
Yeah.
Or you use rebates to try to mask it. Transparency, when to use and when not to use, is a whole nother 40-minute podcast that would be fascinating. But it's something I thought of frequently at Medtronic. How and when to use transparency. We would use rebates to secure business and to secure commitment, but also to keep our net pricing out of these third-party databases. All right. So we did not want to be as transparent. In the airline industry, where I first started, price transparency helped them maintain prices for a long time. All the airlines would submit to a third party 3 times a day their fares. They would see what everyone was doing. They would end up settling on the same prices for the same routes. Now, in the same industry, when that pricing went to from brick and mortar travel agencies to the Expedias and Orbits and online outlets, there was a 20% haircut in price. So transparency is very fascinating. And we actually attempted to use price transparency to solve the drug-eluting stent pricing problem that we talked about earlier. We actually launched 2017 a pricing grid, a volume-based grid, and tried to make it as public as possible. But it crumbled, and this was to prevent the prisoner's dilemma and the downward spiral prices. It crumbled almost in less than a year, and frankly, our own teams didn't have the discipline to stick to it. So they were rebating off it. They were cross business unit selling with it, and it crumbled. But it always amazed me that with only 3 real major players in that space, that they've been unable to use legal market actions, legal market signaling to stabilize pricing. They could have hired Holden to be a third-party entity. They submit their prices to you. You don't negotiate. You just simply publish the prices to the hospitals. And they could have preserved $1,000 on 1.2 million stents a year.
The numbers are staggering.
Theoretically, that could have happened. Yeah, you're talking 1.2 billion in pure profit across 3 players, because everybody's share was a third anyway. Yeah, there's one other area that could be leveraged, and the companies have, I think, the ability to do this. There is an infinite amount of data that is transmitted from patient devices, or if it's not a transmitting device like a knee, you could measure outcomes in terms of hospital readmissions, but hospital economics and population health outcomes, that information is often, it's out there. It might be hard to summarize and get to, but that would be a way for med tech to secure higher prices, is showing how how you keep patients out of the hospital, or you bring them to lower cost areas of the hospital, or you can diagnose earlier. It's also better for patients, and it takes costs out of the healthcare system, and that could be rewarded with higher pricing. Depending on the administration, we did some risk share contracts at Medtronic, things like infection reduction, inappropriate shock reduction, heart failure readmission rate reduction. It's difficult to contract those because you have to make sure both sides agree on how you're measuring that. But at least standing behind your product outcomes in that way, just that negotiation approach would help preserve some price. So that's probably the most effective, newish way to go about it.
That as an approach could also be super helpful for so many other companies with market volatility right now, when you're willing to go on the line for the quality of the product or the outcomes of the product or whatever. I feel like risk sharing is such a good one across the board.
I totally agree. It's helping your customer agree on how to measure it. They often will understand the value. You can calculate a suggested or approximate value for them, or create a calculator such that you have the levers in place and they can calculate their own savings if X happens because they use your product.
Scott, I got one more question for you. I'm going to go a little off the reservation here. Let's
Okay.
say you were to go into a different industry. What's one pricing practice or pricing rule or pricing concept that you feel like has been well demonstrated in the med tech space that you think should just be applied somewhere else? And I'll give you an example. So you worked in the airline industry, and you gave us a good example of how some of the tactics that they used in the airline industry should likely be applied to medical devices because they're just really a sign of best practice with certain market characteristics. Is there something from the medical space that if you were to go somewhere else, you would automatically think, I'm going to take this from what I've known, my experience, and bring it into a new industry?
The philosophy of facts over frig, first of all, because I'm certain that medtech isn't the only place using fear and rhetoric and intuition and gut to make decisions. So that's part of it. The risk share approach could be applied to many industries. We just talked about that. And I absolutely believe benchmarking your products, your prices and products across as many variables and demographic information as you have could apply anywhere. Negotiations, benchmark tool, product assessment model of some kind, and then put your promise behind your product and come up with a risk share. They're not new, but those are things that could apply in any industry to some extent.
I think it's a great answer.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's our episode. Thank you both. Covered a lot.
It was great.
A lot to go through. This is great. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
So great to spend the time. Thanks, Scott.